Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus Christ himself said this in Matthew chapter 24 in the Olivet Discourse. And there's actually a few different ways that people interpret this sentence, this one verse. And generally, it's without the context that surrounds it. So we're going to decipher this together in this edition of Bible Scribe.
I am Bible Scribe, and I am dedicated to bringing you simple and honest study of the Bible. I have studied a large body of works from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the early Christian writings. I am a technology professional, and I bring an analytical approach to the studies that we will do together. If you have been discouraged by the many voices telling you what the Bible says, stay tuned, because we will break through the noise and get to a plain understanding of the things of God, based on the Scriptures. Thank you for joining me in growing closer to Him. Let's get started.
Hey, welcome back, guys. It is Bible Scribe. Great to be back with you. Been a little slow getting the videos out lately, and that's just due to a few different things. But, you know, the channel is based on a few different concepts that we've gone over. It's very focused highly on eschatology and a historical view of the events of the first century and prophecy fulfillments that occurred then and the prophecy fulfillments that will occur, and how the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha relate to that. And so, you know, as time goes on, it's like I want to stay true to the channel and the content that I provide, but also I'm exploring new things on my own that are very divergent sometimes from what's on the channel. So it's hard sometimes for me to decide whether certain topics need to be brought to the channel or that's just something that's interesting to me but might not be interesting to everyone else. So just know that I'm still here, that videos will continue to come like this one today. And this was actually brought up to me by a viewer. It's a question that was asked, and that was, you know, what does Matthew chapter 24 verse 35, what does it really mean when Jesus says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away? The two prevailing views on this verse particularly is that when Jesus says heaven and earth will pass away, is that number one, that he is talking about something way off in the future, that heaven and earth will pass away, and that is in relationship to the other things in the Olivet Discourse that are way off in the future. And of course, this is the futurist viewpoint of eschatology, where a futurist was one who believes that the Olivet Discourse and most of the things in the New Testament that are prophetic are in our future, way off 2,000 years or more from when they were said, and that when Christ said those things in Matthew 24 to the disciples, that he wasn't really specifically talking to them. He was talking to some people way out in the future, and most of the people that have that viewpoint think it is them that is being talked to, that Jesus was talking to in surrogate through the disciples. Then the other prevailing viewpoint by those who accept a historical view of what Christ did and said in the Olivet Discourse and what happened in the first century, culminating in Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD. Those people usually come to this passage, they see verse 35, and I'll go ahead and bring it up in front of us so we can look at it, but they see this verse 35. I'll try to get my head out of the way here. But they see this verse, and a preterist or historicist will approach this and say, well, heaven and earth, he's saying, are going to pass away at that time, meaning in the first century. But the reason he said heaven and earth was because he meant the temple. Because obviously heaven and earth did not pass away literally in the first century. And so those who take a historical viewpoint, and generally most of those people think everything that's in these prophecies was going to happen in the first century. So they have to explain that. And the way they do is they say, well, heaven and earth didn't mean heaven and earth. It meant the temple. And both of these two views that I've just presented to you, I'm going to show in this video how neither one is correct. Neither of these views is correct on verse 35 of Matthew 24. Because we've got to take into some things into account. We've got to take into account the context, and we've got to take into account the structure of the sentence, and we're going to look at just a little bit of Greek so that we can understand what is actually being said in this verse, and whether it does relate to heaven and earth passing away, or if it relates to the temple, or if it relates to the first century, or if it relates to our future. And this is one of those passages that my view, and I believe it is the correct view. It's based on, you're going to see, it's based on being very careful with the text and understanding how these sentences are constructed and what they are talking about, what the context says they are talking about. But my view on this, as you're going to see, is what makes me diverge from both groups, both futurist groups who think all of the Olivet Discourse is talking about the future from present day, and I diverge from the historicists on this, that this verse is talking about necessarily the first century, that heaven and earth were going to pass away in the first century, and that it was relating to something figurative, meaning the temple, and not literal. And I do diverge from both those viewpoints. So let's get into this verse and why that is the case. Now, one thing I always do when I come to the Olivet Discourse, because it's important, we have to realize that the Olivet Discourse is not in just one place in the Scripture. This speech that Jesus gave to the disciples is in 3 different places in Scripture. Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. So the first thing we're going to do here as we're looking at this is we're going to look first here. It says, chapter 24 of Matthew, verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Okay? And this is in a section that's, in the King James, it's got this caption of the lesson of the fig tree. You can see verse 32, learn the parable of the fig tree when its branch is tender and puts forth leaves, etc., etc. So let's look at Mark chapter 13 and see if it says similar things or if there's some divergence. So here's Mark 13. And we can see here that it's similarly captioned in the King James Version. But it's about the fig tree when the branch is yet tender and put forth leaves. It seems there's about the same amount of text. And then verse 31 in Mark 13 says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So it seems very similar. Now let's just double check in Luke chapter 21, verses 29 through 33 to see if it's similar. And yes, it looks like it's very similar. He spoke to them in a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, summer is at hand. Heaven and earth shall pass away, in verse 33, but my words shall not pass away. So we see here that this part of the Olivet Discourse is very similar, almost exact, in all 3 accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I always do that check because there are some parts of the Olivet Discourse that are just slightly differently recorded in each of those passages. So, that's one thing you can take away from this study and do on your own is, and I've recommended this in other videos, if you're going to study the Olivet Discourse, take Matthew and Mark and Luke's account of that speech by Jesus Christ and examine them side by side by side. Look at the differences. They're important. Particularly, there's one about the abomination of desolation that is key to understanding what the Olivet Discourse was about. But I'll leave that for you to figure out. It's in some of my other videos, and you can definitely do that research on your own. All right, so the next thing we need to look at as we go into this discussion is the sentence structure. So let's look at Matthew again. Go back to Matthew chapter 24, verse 35. And it's very simple. We just want to make sure as we examine this that we're thinking of it in the way the sentence is written, okay? Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So what is the point of this sentence? Is it that heaven and earth shall pass away, or is it my words shall not pass away? It sounds like he is trying to make the point that his words will not pass away. And as an example or a contrast to that, he's saying heaven and earth will pass away. Okay, so he's saying my words will not pass away. That's the main subject, concept of this verse. And as a contrast to show that they won't pass away, he says it's opposite to heaven and earth because they will pass away. Okay, so we need to understand that sentence structure. The main idea here is not that the heaven and earth will pass away. The main idea here is that his words are not going to pass away. And let's also check the words here. It's important that we do this also. So I will pull up now the Greek of this verse because it's key to understand these words. Now, the key part is where it says heaven and earth will pass away. What is the word heaven and what is the word earth? The word heaven in Greek is oranos, and that is the sky. The word earth in Greek is ge or gehe, and that is land. It's like earth, meaning soil, land. What he's saying here is not when we think of heaven and earth, we think of heaven where God sits on his throne and earth. No, this is saying in the Greek that the sky and the earth, everything under the firmament, will pass away. Everything above the first firmament, by the way, is heaven, okay? Is the true heaven, the spiritual heaven. And so this is really in the Greek saying all the material world is going to pass away, but my words will not pass away, as the rest of this verse says. My words, the logoi of me, will not pass away. So just to realize those two things. First, that this is showing a contrast between the material world passing away and God's words or Jesus's words never passing away. And then the second thing is that it's saying the sky and the earth or everything that is material passing away. Not necessarily talking about heaven where God's throne is or the 7 levels of heaven that we've discussed in other videos. This is everything below the firmament. And that's according to the Greek, which we're looking at right here. So it's not like we're taking this a place it doesn't go. This is exactly what it means. Now that we've looked at that one sentence, we need to also, for sure, look at the context of this verse. So verse 35 doesn't exist in a vacuum, obviously, but we can get the context of this verse just by reading the previous few verses. So that starts with verse 32, really. And so we'll read verses 32, 33, 34, and 35 together and talk about that. It says, "Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is close, it's nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see these things, know that it is near, at the doors. It's close. Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." Now, what things is he talking about? Well, this is one speech from Jesus Christ. He's talking about everything before verse 32. So in verses 1 through 32, he's talking about the temple being destroyed, about tribulation, about needing to flee the city. It's going to get bad. All these different things, earthquakes. And he says that this generation will not pass until these things are fulfilled. And then there's our next sentence that we're studying, because this is the context of it now. He's saying everything's coming very soon. He says, even the material world will pass away in verse 35. But my words will not pass away. Meaning, it's not just going to not happen. All these things I've said are going to happen because my words won't return void, essentially. They won't pass away. The material world passes away, but these words are essentially set in time. And it's in the context of trying to explain to the disciples how close these things are. That I'm not just saying this, it's really going to happen to you in your lifetimes, according to verse 34. That this generation, the generation you disciples are in, will not pass until all of these things I've said, earthquakes, pestilence, tribulation, destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, will be fulfilled. Okay? And it's so also realizing in that context, he's not talking about heaven and earth passing away in the first century. He's using that as a reference of contrast to his words not passing away, and that all the prior things that he has said will be fulfilled. All right? So, we've now looked at the context to understand this and seen that it's all coming quickly, and that was the point of this sentence, this verse 35 even, that Christ's words weren't going to be void, they were coming soon, and everything he said before this in verses 1 through 32 are going to occur in your lifetime. Now, the question of could this be a reference to the temple is as we've shown, it's really false. This is not talking about the temple because, according to the structure of these sentences, the context that's involved, he's not saying this verse 35 is not a part of the prophecy. He's already given the prophecy. He's saying all these things I've just told you, these prophecies of these coming tribulations and the destructions of the temple, these things will happen. And as an example of that they will happen, my words are not going to pass away, but the heaven and the earth pass away. But in contrast, my words don't. When I say something, it happens. So the part about heaven and earth passing away here is only an example and is not part of this prophecy, as he has already given all of the prophetic events of the prophecy, the signs that the disciples asked for. They came to him and said, Jesus, you say you're coming. What are going to be the signs of that coming? And so he tells them in verses 1 through 32. And then he says, it's coming quick. It's really coming quick. He says in verse 34, verily I say to you, you will not die. This generation won't pass until these things come. And just in case you're still wondering, in contrast, the heaven and earth will pass away, but these words I've just given you will not pass away. They will come to pass. So in the correct understanding of this passage and of that specific verse, Matthew 24, verse 35, this is not out in the future, and it's not the temple passing away. He already said that the temple would be destroyed. This is simply an example to help them understand that his words in this case are true and that these things he's talked about will come quickly. Now, it's interesting to me too that, as we have demonstrated this, that heaven and earth will pass away, he says, but my words will not pass away. It's interesting that in my other videos and my other research, if you followed me, you've seen that we've gone through multiple old scriptures and writings and pseudepigraphal works, Dead Sea Scrolls, that talk about the complete and utter destruction of the material world after 7,000 years of human history, of material world history. 6 days and a seventh, that's a Sabbath. That's 6 prophetic days, and a seventh as a Sabbath. That's a week of prophetic days, 1,000-year periods. The Jews have known this, and if you read the rabbinical and historical midrashic writings, they talk about this. It was always known by the Jewish nation that there were going to be 6,000 years, the Messiah, and then a 7,000th years that was a Sabbath time period where the Messiah kingdom of God would reign. And at the end of that, the material world would be destroyed. This was the understanding. It's such an old prophecy, and it's the first prophecy that was given to man, by the way. We read in other texts that Adam received this prophecy. So we know that Christ referring in this verse to the heaven and earth passing away was something these people would have known about. The disciples knew that the Jewish idea, which they were mostly Jews, was that in 7,000 years the material world would pass away, that God would be done with it. And so for him to use this contrasting statement here makes complete sense to them. He's saying, heaven and earth are going to pass away just as the old prophecies say, but my words here are not going to pass away. I've said and told you again and again here, everything is coming quickly that I have told you. The tribulations, the earthquakes, the pestilence, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It's all coming quickly. And just in case you didn't think so, he says in verse 34, verily I say to you, it will come quickly. And in 35, my words here aren't going to pass away. Heaven and earth, they'll pass away as the prophecies foretold in the future. But my words will not pass away. These things I've told you are coming to pass in your lifetimes. Does that help clarify? I think it should help you clarify what is being said here. They had knowledge of these prophecies and context that was beyond just the scope of what we read in this one passage. As well as we've proven out in this passage itself, the sentence structure, the context is simply, it's a language construct that Christ used to show them, I'm trying to prove to you verbally that my words here about what's coming in your lifetimes is true, and it's going to come to pass. I'm the Redeemer, and these things are true. They're going to happen. But he is not here saying, Jesus Christ is not saying either that heaven and earth were going to pass away in the lifetime of the disciples, or that heaven and earth were the temple and it was going to pass away. He already said the temple was going to pass away earlier in the passage. It has nothing to do with that. And he's definitely not saying, as he's not saying with anything in this passage, that all of this passage is out in the future. He is making a reference to a prophecy they had had since Adam, that the earth would, at the end of time, be destroyed and recycled, or whatever you want to call it. That the material world was finite. You could ask any ancient Jew, even a Jew up to, even in the modern time, the Jews will say the earth and the material world is finite. It will end. Except for, of course, a lot of the Pharisaical Jews, which don't believe in the spiritual. So they think that the earth will continue forever. And that is actually a change from ancient Jewish belief. But you know, when Jesus was on earth and the Pharisees started, or it was the Sadducees that were really against the spiritual. They didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in spiritual things. But we know that's not true. And all these ancient writings that I've studied on this channel with you point to this same thing. So this reference to that prophecy was just to demonstrate that Christ was being serious about these other things coming in the lifetimes of the disciples, because they asked him about this. And yes, by the way, according to all these prophecies that we have studied, in the future from now, the material world will be destroyed or done away with. It will pass away, and that's what he's referring to here. I hope this has been informative for you. This is a really fun study. I was really interested and glad that my viewer had mentioned this and that we discussed it. It gave me some food for thought on this, and I think that this is helpful for you guys as well. That gives you some insight into how to read these passages, how to really deconstruct them. Use some Greek helps to make sure you understand the language of what's being said. This is not heaven, meaning where angels live or where God lives, and earth, meaning the globe ball. This is the sky and the dirt, the sky and the land that is below the firmament. The material world will pass away. My words aren't going to pass away, but this is He's saying this just to demonstrate to them that he's being truthful with them. This is serious, and in their lifetimes, they're going to have tribulations, pestilences, earthquakes. The soldiers of Rome would come against Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. And all of that occurred. It shows that what he said in verse 35 was true. He was trying to emphasize that it was going to happen, and it did. But that was not heaven and earth passing away. He was using that as an example. God bless you guys. Thank you for joining me for yet another Bible Scribe video, and there will be more. Take care.